Russia invading Ukraine is not about saving Russians in Ukraine or eliminating Nazis. I've said this for 3 years now. Hell, I said it back in 2014 when they invaded Crimea, and I have been studying Russia for 18 plus years now. And these moves have nothing to do with protecting Russians and everything to do with expanding Russia's empire. And now we have further proof coming out of the Russian Foreign Ministry. They aren't even hiding their ambitions anymore. Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov recently was asked the question about what's the future of relations with the United States, the West, and the outcomes of Ukraine. He stated, quote, "The American side requires practical steps aimed at eliminating the root causes of the fundamental contradictions between us and the areas of security. Among these causes, NATO expansion is in the foreground. Without resolving this fundamental and most acute problem for us, it simply is impossible to resolve the current conflict in the Euro-Atlantic region." Notice he says now they've expanded it to the Euro-Atlantic region. It's no longer this conflict in Ukraine. It's no longer a special military operation. It's the Euro-Atlantic region. They are expanding as just kind of testing the rhetoric here. He went on to state, quote, "Given the nature and genesis of the Ukrainian crisis provoked by the previous U.S. authorities and West as a whole, this conflict naturally acts, well, if you like, as a test, a trial which checks the seriousness of Washington's intentions to straighten out our relations." So there it is. They're overtly stating that we went to war against Ukraine to test the intentions of the United States, to see what the U.S. would do. Would they respond? How serious is the United States in bringing back the equal relations with Russia? Let me be clear. We are not equals. Your GDP is smaller than like 4 of our states. You are not on equal footing with the United States. This is not 1960. So essentially, what Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov is stating is that this war will not end unless NATO reverses course on its expansion. He's stated this multiple times. And what he means is removing troops from the Baltic states. He is arguing that NATO's military presence in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania is a core reason for the war continuing in Ukraine. Ryabkov suggests now that addressing this issue is essential for resolving that war, which marks a massive shift in Russia's stance, which previously was focused on Ukraine's neutrality, non-membership in NATO, protecting Russians, and eliminating Nazism. These new demands raise the stakes, and it now involves the security of actual NATO member states. But the thing is Russia has continually been the aggressor, so NATO views its Baltic deployments as defensive. Ryabkov's comments further solidify this reasoning, and it frames the Ukraine war as a broader test of Western intentions, particularly those of the United States. He accused previous U.S. administrations in the West of provoking the war in Ukraine through NATO expansion, and he actually feels that Donald Trump will be more likely to turn a blind eye towards possible Russian expansion into Baltic nations. He actually says the Kremlin is expressing cautious optimism about the potential for U.S.-Russia talks, noting recent phone calls between Trump and Putin. However, he also noted that any lasting peace requires addressing NATO's presence in those countries, a condition that the alliance is not going to accept, period. But here's the thing. This is a classic Russian tactic where they anchor the new norm in policy to see if it flies, see how far they can go. They use lower-level officials, such as a deputy foreign minister, to say potentially inflammatory and outrageous things, and if we in the West let it slide, then it elevates. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov will then start repeating it. And if we continue to ignore it, then Putin himself will start repeating it, and it becomes new policy. This happens every time because we don't address it in the initial stages when Russians are floating it as new ideas. At this point, right now, when Ryabkov said this, all Western countries need to say no. That's not fucking happening. You're not doing that. You don't get to use current NATO members as negotiating chips to end the war you started. That's off the table. Period. Oh, and if you try anything, we'll skull drag you across Eastern Europe and put a Disneyland in Moscow. At some point, we need to have a little bit of Winston Churchill in us, but that requires some Winston Churchill-esque leadership. Russia is trying to pressure NATO and exploit some of these cracks that are forming. Some countries, including the United States, have been hemming and hawing about whether the Baltics are worth fighting for. Make no mistake, they are, because, like Ukraine, there's a series of dominoes. And if Ukraine falls, Georgia, Moldova, those are the first dominoes. Then if we start seeing Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and we do nothing, even though they're NATO members, those are the next dominoes. And then we have a very serious problem of a potential world war as Russia is emboldened to try to move into Poland. Now, obviously, this statement from Ryabkov is designed to rally domestic support by portraying the war as a fight against Western encirclement. But in making these types of statements, they reveal their true intentions. This was never about defending Russians in Ukraine and eliminating Nazism. It was about taking Ukraine and then finding an excuse to test NATO's resolve. They are incrementally upping their demands over time in a slow enough fashion that they think Western leaders won't recognize what is taking place. But even if we recognize what is happening, and even if we overtly say, hey, this is what's happening, if we don't immediately shut it down with credible threats of violence against Russia, then the Kremlin is just going to see it as permission.